Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I don't have any funny car stories today, so we're just going to jump right into the sermon. But before we do, I just want to make a reminder. In the foyer, there is a sheet, a sign-up sheet. It's for if anyone would like to join with the rest of your brothers and sisters in committing to praying and studying for 15 to 30 minutes a day this year. Again, like I said last week, I'm not coming to your house to check up on you. You're not going to see me at 6:30 a.m. on a Tuesday saying, have you prayed yet today? It's not going to happen. One, because I won't be up yet. And two, because that's not what it's about. We're not here to check off a list. We're here to take seriously our discipleship. So if you would like to take part in that, encourage one another, that sign-up list is in the foyer. And as we go through the year, we'll have prayer requests. Of course, you have your bulletin. I would encourage you to take your bulletin home with you. It's a good thing to keep at hand to pray during the week for the needs on the bulletin. A lot of us tend to forget, usually, let's face it, by Monday, whatever was said at the end of the announcements. We tend to forget that. But if you have your bulletin with you, you can remember at least most of it and keep the prayers that are on there on your heart. We are continuing on the task of discipleship. Really, we're taking the task of the Great Commission seriously. But the Great Commission, found in Matthew 28, says this: "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you." We're taking that last part and focusing on it here for the next few weeks because before we can ever hope to teach someone else how to be a disciple, we have to first be a disciple. Last week we began by looking at the principle of Christians, of disciples of Christ, being a peaceful people, putting aside anger, putting aside pride. We looked at Matthew 5. If you'd like to go back and look at that on YouTube or Facebook, you can't because the sound guy forgot to hit the record button last week. You can be mad at them. FYI, I was the sound guy last week, so you can be mad at me. It was probably the best sermon that was ever told, and you missed it if you weren't here. You'll just have to live with that. So, I can't do anything about it. But if you missed it last week, you find it in Matthew 5. It's Jesus' first command on putting aside anger. But really, it's a command that has a principle behind it of being a peaceful people. This week, we're going to look at more principles. And this week, we're going to look at a very hard principle. A principle that, quite frankly, I don't think many Christians ever even try to apply to their lives, much less succeed in. What is it? Well, let's see what Jesus' next command was in Matthew 5. "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.'" And you might say to yourself, "Oh, wait a minute. I've never committed adultery. What are you talking about? That's not that hard." I mean, we know plenty of Christians fail this, but it's not a terribly difficult command. Well, I don't think this is just about adultery. Exodus 20:14 and the 10 Commandments is where Christ is, of course, referring, "You shall not commit adultery." But you know already, if you were here last week, that what Jesus is saying is not the end of the command, it's really just the beginning. He's getting ready to lay out something far deeper. He says, "You shall not commit adultery." That's just the beginning. The principle he's going to lay down is a principle of self-control. It's a principle that Christians don't tend to really think of as a discipleship task. Now, I don't know about you, when I was growing up, no one ever said to be a disciple of Christ you need to be self-controlled, despite the fact that it's all throughout the New Testament that Christians are supposed to be self-controlled. But we struggle with it in the modern day. In fact, self-control has almost become an evil in the modern world. After all, we have so much. Why not partake in it? We make excuses for why we couldn't possibly be self-controlled. The McDonald's was right there and I was hungry. What was I going to do? Wait until I got home to eat? No, I'm going to eat right now. But Jesus lays out the principle in a way that's not only shocking, but honestly, almost by today's standards, impossible. He says, "But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." That's a pretty shocking statement. Jesus just said that even if you've managed not to commit the outward sin, but you wanted to commit it, you failed. Suddenly it goes from, I do a pretty good job of keeping the commandments, to I'm pretty sure I fail at this consistently. We all do. Most of us never think about the fact that the desire itself is a problem in our heart. Now, I underline that word heart. I want you to keep it in mind because we'll bring it up again here. But this seems like an impossible task when you think about it. Jesus isn't just saying don't commit adultery. He's saying don't even have the desire to. Is that even possible? Is it possible to restrain the heart in such a manner? As an example of how hard this is, a 2019 study found that roughly 66% of 14 to 15-year-olds, not adults, 14 to 15-year-olds, had seen pornographic images at some point, with over 50% claiming their first viewing had been unintentional. That is, accidental. They weren't trying to view it. It just happened. That was how my first time happened. I was 8 years old. I was looking up cheat codes for a video game, and I typed in the wrong letter, and suddenly I was looking at something I should not have been looking at. It's incredibly easy. For adults, the number rises past 85%, and I expect if people were really honest, we're probably getting closer to 100. How in the world can we hope to fulfill what Jesus is telling us? To get rid of that desire when it's literally at your fingertips all the time. Everywhere you go, if you've been down in a major city in the last decade, you've almost certainly seen a billboard or an advertisement for something like a strip club or something of the sort. I remember when we used to go to Detroit all the time, we'd go watch hockey games. And we'd be driving up the highway, and on the highway going into Detroit, there would be big billboards with provocatively clothed women advertising a strip club. Now, me, being the passenger, I could turn away or something, but it's not like my dad could just lower his head while he's on the highway doing 75. You have to keep driving. It's right there. You can't escape it. So what's the point of even trying? Well, perhaps it's because Jesus wasn't telling us to stop looking. He was telling us to get control of the heart. Jesus doesn't say, if you look at a woman, you have a problem. He says if you look at a woman with lust in your heart, that you have a problem. He's not talking about outward in, he's talking about inward out. He's talking about something which we actually are able to control as Christians, but most of us don't ever try. That fallen nature. The part of us that's supposed to die when we come into Christ, but which most of us keep alive for the rest of our lives. That's what he's talking about. He's not setting an impossible standard, even though it sounds like it at a glance. He's actually setting a very possible standard, but it's one we don't tend to take seriously. So the first thing we need to understand, if we're going to actually apply this principle, is we have to master our hearts. That word for heart is cardia. It means the seat of physical, spiritual, and mental life, specifically emotions and desires. Jesus is not just saying, close your eyes as you walk through the city so that you can hopefully not see someone and fall afoul of lust. And FYI, this applies to far more than just lust. Jesus was not going to be okay with it if you saw someone's house and were jealous of it. That wasn't going to be okay, but lust was not. This applies to anything which would rise out of our heart. What are those things? Well, I think Mark 7, which we were at last week, we looked at Mark 7, but we're going to continue this week. I think he lays it out pretty clearly here. You might remember in Mark 7, where last week we were talking about the Pharisees. They came to Jesus and they wanted Jesus' disciples to wash their hands because they considered that to be defilement, the fact that they weren't washing their hands and then eating. And then Jesus just escalated things to 100 in the next moment and started calling them hypocrites and said that they basically didn't love God at all. Well, this is a continuation of that. Remember, they were talking about defilement. And so Jesus, he also talks about defilement, real defilement. And he called the people to him again and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him, but the thing that comes out of a person are what defile him." Now, Jesus is not saying if you drink battery acid, you're going to be fine. That's not what he's saying. You can very much be hurt by the things which go in you. But in terms of moral cleanliness, it's not what's out going in, it's what's in here that comes out. Jesus' problem was not that there were women in Israel, or that guys saw women in Israel. The problem was what they had in their heart when they saw the women. That's where we tend to fail. So Jesus goes on, because his disciples even have trouble with this. They were Jews. They grew up with this idea that the things you eat, the way you do things, that's what makes you holy. And so they said, what's the deal with this? When he entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable. And he said to them, "Then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled? Thus he declared all foods clean." Now, Jesus is not saying the heart as in like the physical heart. Obviously, that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the spiritual part of us, that fallen nature that we leave there. What we eat does not change that fallen nature. What we put into the body does not change that. It comes from that. If the people he was speaking to were seeking to eat things that were unclean, it began from a place that was already unclean in their heart. It wasn't a problem of what they put in. It was what was coming out. And he goes on and he said, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. We tend to think of it the other way around. These are actions we do. We've committed slander when we actually say something, not when we think it in our heart. We commit envy when we actually spend our time working on getting something of someone else's, not when we just feel it in our heart. But Jesus says it begins right here. This is the part that has to be restrained. This is the part that has to be controlled if we're to actually be true disciples of Christ. Well, that didn't work out the way I thought it was going to. We all know Galatians 5, the fruit of the Spirit, though. So hopefully you can kind of finish the rest of this on your own. Paul in Galatians 5 says that self-control is one of the products of a Christian who is in the Spirit. That means if we are disciples of Christ, self-control should be a byproduct of that. Now that word for self-control, enkratia, means restraint of one's emotions, impulses, or desires. What did Jesus say was the problem? The heart, the seat of our emotions and desires. Paul says that the fruit of the Spirit is restraint of that very thing. To take that thing, which Jesus says is the problem causer, and tame it. We don't do that very often. We spend much of our Christian lives just trying to avoid sin. And make no mistake, you should avoid sin. If you're an alcoholic, don't go to a place where there's beer all the time. That's not a good idea. But there's also the fact that no matter how good we are at avoiding sin, we can't just live our lives completely away from it. We will at some point encounter it again. We have to control ourselves so that when that moment comes, we're ready. We're prepared. We're controlled. You know, I was watching a hockey game last night. In that one hockey game, I must have seen 10 commercials for beer. Now, I don't have a problem with drinking, so it's not a big deal to me. It's whatever. I don't even really see that commercial. But if I was an alcoholic, what am I going to do? Not watch hockey anymore? I mean, I could, but how far do I have to go with that? Eventually, you're going to get to the point where you're just a recluse. You're living in isolation. You know, if you're a human male, Jesus, I don't think, was commending you to a life completely absent of females. That's what some of the monks used to do way back in the day, and the medieval monks. They turned into very weird guys. They came up with very weird ideas. It was not healthy. That was clearly not what Jesus wanted them to do. But when we read it as something that's outside coming in, then what's our answer? We'll avoid what's on the outside. But that wasn't what Jesus was saying. Jesus was saying if we control what's inside, then we won't be tempted by what's outside. He's not saying that, go test yourself by going down to the strip club. But in normal everyday life, we should be able to overcome the circumstances that come towards us. But it requires self-control. It requires us to have tamed our heart already, not just decide in the moment I'm going to have a sudden burst of willpower. We tend to act that way. We see our ability to resist sin as some kind of magical thing. We come into Christ and then Christ just puts a barrier between us and sin and we just never sin anymore. And if we do, it couldn't have been our fault. Christ should have stopped me. That's not how it works. It's a training. It's a discipline. It's something we have to work on. It's a muscle that must be brought up full. I don't know how many people in here you've worked out before. When you lifted the dumbbell, was that the last time you ever had to lift the dumbbell? Did you immediately look like Arnold Schwarzenegger? No. Why? Well, because training is an ongoing process. To get stronger, you have to keep doing it. And more than just that day, you have to keep going back and going back. And if you stop, guess what? You get weaker. It has to be an ongoing process. That's why what Kyler read earlier, why do we train? Why do we continue the fight? Why do we keep running? Because if we stop, we get weaker. In 1 Corinthians 9, Paul said, "So I do not run aimlessly." This is a continuation of what Kyler read. "I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others I myself should be disqualified." Paul says it's a discipline. It's something he has to continually do. He's constantly training in self-control. He's not just leaving it to chance and hoping that when temptation arises, in that moment he just finds the willpower. That's not what self-control is. Self-control is a process. It's a workout regimen. It's something you do continually. It's something that the first day you do it, you won't be a world beater. If tomorrow, if you struggle with, let's say you struggle with smoking and you really want to quit, and tomorrow you decide, "I'm going to quit," and guess what? You quit cold turkey. You know what your success rate is? It's less than 10%. You know why? Because that's not how we were made to function. You don't have the strength build up. You don't have the willpower build up. It takes time. You have to slowly work at it. You have to cut it out slowly. If you want to eat well, you know the worst way to start eating well is on January 1st, go from a terrible diet to only eating salad. That is the worst possible way to do it because the body's not used to it. The body still's hungry for all those things it's had before. Well, guess what? Your spiritual fallen self is still hungry. Even after you've been baptized into Christ, it still wants all those things. It still wants all the stuff it's supposed to have left behind. It doesn't magically go away. It has to be trained. It has to be tamed. It has to be worked out to follow the path of righteousness. It's not something that happens by magic. And yet it is something that if we are to be disciples of Christ, we are commanded to take up. Self-control is a vital part of Christian discipleship. And we'll see why here. Because as we go forward, we'll understand it very much applies to the second principle we're going to talk about today. Before we do, how do we actually exercise self-control? We have to cut out our eyes. And that's kind of a provocative statement, I know. And I actually thought about changing it, but then I realized I'm just quoting Jesus, so maybe I should leave it in there. Jesus goes on, he says, "If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell." Now, Jesus is not advocating for you to cut out body parts. That is not what's happening here. Instead, he's using shocking statements to evoke in people the understanding that sin needs to be treated severely. It needs to be treated as dangerous, in the same way we treat firearms and vehicles as dangerous. But we don't treat them as dangerous and then say, just ignore them. What do? We teach people how to control them. We show people how to use them. They are to be trained in the function so that they're properly used. Jesus is saying the same thing. He's not saying literally cut off your hand. And FYI, guys, actual guys, that's a euphemism. It's for a body part you don't want to lose. And that's kind of extreme and it's kind of shocking. But maybe that should tell us how seriously Jesus considers sin and its effect on our lives. Whatever it is that causes us to sin, we are to get it under control. We are to treat it severely. We are to starve the part of us that is hungry for evil and feed the part of us that desires God. In Galatians 5, in the part that precedes the fruit of the Spirit, Paul puts it this way, "But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh." It really is that simple. Paul just laid it out for us. How do we get self-control? Walk by the Spirit. How do I walk by the Spirit? It's quite literally all right here. One of the reasons a lot of Christians say they don't want to work on their self-control is because they don't know how. No, you do know how. We've always known how. We just don't often read the how. We often leave it on our bookshelf. We often leave it aside. The how has been right in front of us the whole time. It's quite simple. Do the things Christ has commanded us. Live our life pursuing Him. In doing so, we starve that part of us that desires evil. Paul continues on, "For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh, for these are opposed to each other, to keep you from doing the things you want." There are two roads going in opposite directions. You cannot go down one and go down the other. If you go down the path of the flesh, you get further from the path of the Spirit. That's just the way it is. Elsewhere in Romans, Paul would say that those who are in the flesh cannot please God. He doesn't say we'll have a hard time pleasing God, might struggle with it. He says cannot please God. If you're going down the road of the flesh, you cannot please God. But a lot of Christians try to live their lives walking down that road of their old selves. Walking down the road that was supposed to die when they went into baptism. They keep going down it. Let me keep chasing after things which are temporary. Let me keep fulfilling the desires of my flesh. Let me keep doing things that I used to do before I was baptized that I know are wrong, but which, hey, I'm just a human being. And then we're confused. Why is it we can't seem to ever get closer to God? Because you're going in the opposite direction. The answer, the way to gain self-control is simple. Turn around and take the other road. The longer you're going down the road of righteousness, the further you're getting away from that road of the flesh. The more that part of you that is sinful begins to starve. Doesn't mean it goes away. I don't know if any of you have ever been hungry, but when you're hungry, you start to do some stupid things for food. I mean, I've eaten at places that if I was actually not super hungry, I would never have even thought about eating at. But I was starving, and it was right there. And I said, well, you know what? I'm going to eat right here. As we get hungrier and hungrier, that can happen. As you get spiritually hungrier and hungrier, or physically, I guess we would say hungrier and hungrier, the fleshly part of you, you're going to be tempted to do some stupid things. You might even do some stupid things. Paul said that he struggled with this his whole life. In Romans, he says that he constantly does things he doesn't want to do, even though he knows he's supposed to do them. It's not a one-and-done thing. It's a process. That's why Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9, he has to continually discipline his body and train. Because he knows if he stops, that part of him that's starving will draw him back the other direction. If we're going to be a self-controlled people, the task is simple. We have to walk on the road of righteousness. We have to pursue Christ and his commands, but the actual execution is difficult. It requires us to be committed. It requires us to take it seriously. It requires us to be ready to go through some uncomfortable parts of life. Sometimes it might have to be extreme. If your problem is lust, it might require you for a time to turn off the television, to turn off the computer, to do things which to the outside world look nonsensical, but which you realize you have to do because you are training your body. That doesn't mean you have to stay off it forever. There does come a time when it should be okay for you to turn that television on because that desire has been controlled. But it doesn't mean that we get a free pass when we struggle. It doesn't mean that we can just throw our hands up and say, well, I'm a human being like everybody else. You are a human being like everybody else, but you're also supposed to be a disciple, which means you are called to be the light of the world. Someone who takes seriously the commands of their master and does not look like everybody else when it's all said and done. Self-control is a vital part of the process. The second principle, and this goes very much in hand with the first principle, and these three commands that we're talking about today, I don't really see as separate commands. I think they're actually supposed to be read together. Because we're supposed to be a people of fidelity. That is a faithful people. Jesus goes on to the next part in Matthew 5:31. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. And I know Christians get a little uncomfortable when we talk about divorce. I tell you, if you're uncomfortable, the preacher is way more uncomfortable than you are. So if I got to go down this road, you have to come with me. Jesus is probably referring to Deuteronomy 24. This is the only place where a certificate of divorce is really mentioned as a command. But he's not really talking about divorce so much at the moment. He goes on, but I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Keep that word adultery in mind, because it does mean one thing. It does mean infidelity in marriage, but it also has other connotations in Scripture. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. And what is he referencing here? Well, probably Leviticus 19. There are a couple verses like this. Not 100% sure which one he's talking about, but Leviticus 19:12 says, you shall not swear by my name falsely, and so profane the name of the Lord your God. I am the Lord. But it's also quite possible Jesus was referencing one of the Ten Commandments. Exodus 20, verse 7. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Now, somehow Christians in the modern day have turned that into a language law, as if somehow God was concerned with us saying the word God in a place where it shouldn't belong. I don't think that's a good idea, but that's not what this verse is talking about. This is talking about oaths, about using God's name as a backup to what you want to do. All throughout Scripture, we see oaths, and when they're broken, they're considered a pretty serious offense by God. God is saying to them, look, you don't get to just use me to back up whatever you're doing. If you do, and you fail to follow through, you're not going to be held guiltless for that. Because at that point, you're not just dishonoring yourself, you're dishonoring God. And I think Jesus was probably talking about both of these things. He's probably talking about the entire concept of faithfulness. And I think he's talking about it for both these commands. Because he goes on, but I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. You see, the Jews had a way around the prohibition on using God's name in an oath. We'll just swear by the temple. It's not God. We'll just swear by the earth. It's not God. And Jesus says, no, you've missed the actual point. The point was your word's supposed to mean something. You're supposed to be trustworthy. And FYI, it all belongs to God anyway. So whatever you swear upon, you're still invoking him in some manner. It's about faithfulness. Now, the New Testament writers did not seem to take this as a prohibition against oaths themselves. Paul had oaths in his letters. 1 Thessalonians 5, Paul says, I put you under oath before the Lord to have this letter read to all our brothers. There he's invoking the name of God in an oath. Galatians 1:20, and what I am writing to you, before God, I do not lie. Again, he's invoking God in an oath. But I assume Paul took it seriously when he invoked the name of God in an oath. He did not do so lightly. Now, I told you to keep that idea of adultery in mind. There's a reason why. Adultery in the Scripture did not just mean infidelity in marriage. Now, that was its base meaning. But it also had another connotation, simply being unfaithful. That could take a form that was not just about the human body. And in fact, it often took a form in reference of Israel to God. Israel was often called adulterous. Why? Was it because they were having relations outside of marriage? No. It's because they were being unfaithful to God. In Jeremiah 3, that also is showing some weird form. Well, we can't do anything about it now. Jeremiah 3, in verse 8, this is actually talking about Judah, who did not learn from Israel. It says, she saw that for all the adulteries of that faithless one, Israel, I had sent her away with a decree of divorce. Yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but she too went and played the whore. Because she took her whoredom lightly, she polluted the land, committing adultery with stone and tree. This is not talking about the people of Judah actually having relationships with stones and trees. Stones and trees are idols. And the adultery is their unfaithfulness to God in worshiping the idol. The same language is used by James. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you, that you're not self-controlled? You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. You adulterous people. James is not saying you people who keep committing infidelity, at least not in the marital sense. He's saying you people who are unfaithful to God, who are showing a lack of commitment to the Lord, not by going out and continually sinning, but not having self-control over your passions. I don't think they were actually murdering people. I suspect if they were, James's language would have been much harsher in this letter. But they had the intent, the anger in them. They were treating each other poorly. He says, you adulterous people. What does he compare that to then? Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Their adultery is not they've gone out and committed some kind of grand sin. It's that they are not committed to the Father. Their adultery is that they really like what's going on in the world. They want to take part in it. They want to feed that part of them that was supposed to have died in Christ. They want to keep it alive and well. When they prayed, they were praying from a place of selfishness and desire. We do the same thing. When they interacted, they were doing so from a place of anger. We do the same thing. Now, understand, there is forgiveness for us. And we should be very, very grateful for that. Because we fail these commands continually. But that doesn't mean it should be so. James writes this so that the people reading would understand that's not the way it's supposed to be. You're not supposed to be engaging in these things. If you belong to Christ, you're supposed to look like it. Instead, you look just like the world. And unfortunately, that can be said about far too many Christians. Faithfulness to God is a severe and important task. It cannot be completed without our self-control. In fact, I dare say self-control touches on almost every aspect of the Christian existence. Do you struggle with greed? You need self-control. Do you struggle with envy? You need self-control. Do you struggle with faithfulness? You need self-control. But why is faithfulness important? Well, it's important because, like I said a few weeks ago, wherever you are, whether you like it or not, you are a witness of Christ. You might be a terrible witness of Christ, but you're a witness of Christ. When we put on Christ, as Paul said, we need to understand that as an actual act. When people look at us, they're supposed to see Christ, and in a way they do, whether or not we're acting right. We are His representatives on the earth. When we are unfaithful, we're not just dishonoring ourselves, we're dishonoring Him. I dare say taking the Lord's name in vain probably happens far more often without language than within. It happens when we say, I belong to Christ, and we act as if we are part of the world. We're unfaithful. We're adulterous. It's not how it's supposed to be. I know I've gone a little long here today. I'm going to end with just this next section. In 1 Corinthians 6, Paul gives a command to the Corinthians about keeping pure. And he does so by grounding the need for being pure, not in simply the fact that it's right. He could have, but that's not why he says it. He doesn't do it by saying, look, it's just going to embarrass me in front of everyone, or it's going to make you feel bad. No, he says this: flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Is he concerned about our own body? Not quite. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God with your body. When you put on Christ, you stop being whoever you were before. That old part of you, it still exists, it still hungers, but what you've put on now is Christ before the world. When you're not self-controlled, it's not just you who's getting harmed. It's the witness of Christ in the world. When you're unfaithful, not just in a marriage, but in a business deal. When you tell someone, I'll be there to help you move, and you never show up, you're not just harming your own reputation. You're harming Christ's. You have become an ambassador of Christ if you've put Him on, which means faithfulness is a vital part of proper discipleship. How do we be faithful? Well, we need self-control. We have to restrain those emotions and desires which would pull us away from the Lord. It's not an easy task. It's not something that if you've had trouble with it before and you say, I'm going to start tomorrow, that you're going to actually succeed in tomorrow. The first time you lift the weight, other than being sore, you're not going to see any progress. It's going to take time. It's going to take passion and drive, commitment, discipline, and training. It's something you have to carry with you not just tomorrow, but the rest of your life if you want to succeed in it. But if we are going to be disciples who make disciples, then it's what we have to do. A disciple of Christ must be self-controlled and faithful. That takes many forms, but it is the command given to us. Yeah, you should not commit adultery. Yeah, you should not lie and take an oath. But it's not merely about those things. The principle's far greater. Far too many Christians have done damage to their witness because they said, I trust the Lord, and then proved they were just like the world when they were around the world. That cannot be us if we want to be a witness, a true living witness before others. If you're here today and you're not a Christian, but you would like to become one, I'll be in the back as we stand and sing our invitation song. Come and speak with me. If you are a Christian and you just need someone to pray with or talk to, again, I'll be in the back as we stand and sing our invitation song.